From translation, NIV New International Version, this 141 day of the year today we are reading passages, Ezra 1-3, Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 to 11 in the first year of Cyrus king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. The Lord moved the heart of Cyrus king of Persia to make a proclamation throughout his realm and to put it in writing. This is what Cyrus king of Persia says: "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem in Judah with him, and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem, and may their God be with them. And in any location where survivors may now be living, the people are to provide him with silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with freewill offerings for the temple of God in Jerusalem." Then the family heads of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and Levites, everyone whose heart God had moved, prepared to go up and build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. All their neighbors assisted them with articles of silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with valuable gifts, in addition to all the freewill offerings. Moreover, King Cyrus brought out the articles belonging to the temple of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and had placed in the temple of his God. Cyrus king of Persia had them brought by Mithridath the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar the prince of Judah. This was the inventory: gold dishes 30, silver dishes 1,000, silver dishes 29, gold bowls 30, matching silver bowls 410, other articles 1,000. In all there were 5,400 articles of gold and of silver. Sheshbazzar brought all these along with the exiles when they came up from Babylon to Jerusalem. Ezra chapter 2, verses 1 to 70. Now these are the people of the province who came up from the captivity of the exiles, whom Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon had taken captive to Babylon. They returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to their own town, in company with Zerubbabel, Joshua, Nehemiah, Sariah, Reliah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispar, Bigvai, Rehum and Baanah, the descendants of Parosh, 2,172, of Shephatiah, 372, of Arah, 775, of Pahas Moab, namely the descendants of Jeshua and Joab, 2,812, of Elam, 1,254, of Zatu, 945, of Zakkai, 760, of Bani, 642, of Bebai, 623, of Asgad, 1,222, of Adonikam, 666, of Bigvai, 2,056, of Adin, 454, of Ater, that is Hezekiah, 98, of Bezai, 323, of Jorah, 112, of Hashem, 223, of Gibbar, 95, of Bethlehem, 123, of Netophah, 56, of Anassoth, 128, of Asmaveth, 42, of Kiriatharim, Chephirah and Beeroth, 743, of Ramah and Jebah, 621, of Micah, 122, of Bethel and Ari, 223, of Nebo, 52, of Magbish, 156, of Elam, 1,254, of Harim, 320, of Lod, Hadid and Ono, 725, of Jericho, 345, the priests, the descendants of Jediah through the family of Jeshua, 973, of Immer, 1,052, of Pashur, 1,247, of Harim, 1,017, the Levites, the descendants of Jeshua and Kadmiel of the line of Hodaviah, 74, the musicians, the descendants of Asaph, 128, the gatekeepers, the descendants of Shallum, Ater, Talmon, Akub, Hatita and Shobai, 139, the temple servants, the descendants of Zehar, Hasapha, Tabdiel, Keros, Sihah, Padon, Lebanah, Hagabah, Akub, Hagab, Shalmai, Honan, Giddel, Gahar, Reiah, Rezin, Nekoda, Gazam, Uzzah, Pesa, Besai, Asna, Munim, Nephisim, Bakbuk, Hakapha, Hoha, Baslith, Mehida, Harsha, Barkos, Sisra, Tema, Neziah, and Hakos, the descendants of Serva, the descendants of Sophah, the descendants of Hava, the descendants of Salim, the descendants of Pachimd, the descendants of Bani, the descendants of Unmon, the descendants of Abda, the descendants of Aklam, the descendants of Helam, the descendants of Zemir, the descendants of Hashapha, the descendants of Heam, the descendants of Anakath, the descendants of Kizis, the descendants of Pethahiah, the descendants of Karm, the descendants of Ezio, the descendants of Pilo, the descendants of Shilhai, the descendants of Shobai, the descendants of Giddel, the descendants of Shephatiah, the descendants of Hattil, the descendants of Potrath Hazabaim, and the descendants of Armi, the descendants of the slaves of Solomon, the descendants of Sotai, the descendants of Hassaphreth, the descendants of Peruda, the descendants of Jala, the descendants of Darkan, the descendants of Giddel, the descendants of Shephatiah, the descendants of Hattil, the descendants of Potrath Hazabaim, the descendants of Armi. These sought their records in the genealogical lists, but they could not be found, and so were considered unclean and excluded from the priesthood. The governor ordered them not to eat any of the most sacred food until there was a priest to consult Urim and Thummim. The whole company numbered 42,360, besides their 7,337 menservants and maidservants, and their 200 singers and 285 gatekeepers. Their horses were 736, their mules were 245, their camels were 435, and their donkeys were 6,720. When they arrived at the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, some of the heads of the families gave freewill offerings toward the rebuilding of the house of God on its site. According to their ability, they gave to the treasury for the project 61,000 darics of gold, 5,000 minas of silver, and 100 priestly garments. The priests, the Levites, the musicians, the gatekeepers, and the temple servants settled in their own towns, along with some of the other people, and the rest of the Israelites settled in their towns. Ezra chapter 3, verses 1 to 13. When the 7th month came and the Israelites had settled in their towns, the people assembled together as one man in Jerusalem. Then Joshua son of Jozadak and his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel son of Shealtiel, and his associates began to build the altar of the God of Israel to sacrifice burnt offerings on it, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Despite their fear of the peoples around them, they built the altar on its foundation and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and evening burnt offerings. Then they celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles, as it is written, and offered the daily burnt offerings in accordance with what is prescribed. After that, they presented the regular burnt offerings, the new moon sacrifices, and the sacrifices for all the appointed sacred feasts of the Lord, as well as those brought by everyone who wished to give a freewill offering to the Lord. From the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord. Although the foundation of the Lord's temple had not yet been laid, the people were careful to follow the orders given by the Lord through Moses and to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. They gave money to the masons and carpenters, and gave food and drink and oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre in exchange for cedar logs brought by sea from Lebanon to Joppa, as authorized by Cyrus king of Persia. In the 2nd month of the 2nd year after their arrival at the house of God in Jerusalem, Zerubbabel son of Shealtiel, Joshua son of Jozadak, and the rest of the Israelites, all the exiles, began the work and appointed Levites 20 years of age or older to supervise the building of the house of the Lord. When Jeshua and his fellow priests and Zerubbabel and his associates began to build the temple of God in Jerusalem, the workers from the tribe of Judah built the temple of God with songs of praise, accompanied by the prophesying of Jeshua and with the trumpets of the priests, Zechariah son of Jehiel. The people of Israel, including the priests, the Levites, and the rest of the exiles, celebrated the dedication of the foundation of the house of God with joy. With praise and thanksgiving they sang to the Lord, "He is good. His love to Israel endures forever." And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord had been laid. But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads, who had seen the former temple, wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sound of weeping, because the people made so much noise, and the sound was heard far away.